While it's often easy for us to get caught up in the Bible's stranger visions, especially in Revelation, and the stories of war and brutality and violence, the dream of a future when God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven is both clear and compelling. You just heard versions of it from both the Old and the New Testaments, with the details of each of them reflecting the age in which they were written. The first, from Isaiah 11, is a pastoral scene on a mountain, with predator and prey enjoying peaceful coexistence. It reflects the more rural and nomadic lifestyle of Israel about 800 years before the birth of Jesus. The second, at the end of the book of Revelation, was written almost 1,000 years after the first, and reflects a time when Israel was centered around urban life, kingship, wealth, and dependent on the protection of city walls. In that vision, a new Jerusalem descends with none other than God as the king and light of the city, with its gem-encrusted gates and the streets paved with gold that we sing about in some of our hymns. While those two settings are very different, the essence of what they promise is the same: peace, healing, and rest from the ravages of oppression and wickedness. For about a month now, we've been talking about how we engage with God's work of turning death into life, and none of it is easy. Visions like those presented in Isaiah and Revelation put enticing meat on the bones of what that new life might look like if we keep at it, so that we can stay motivated and on the path. Although we think of them as portraying an otherworldly heaven, they're not primarily about what awaits us in an afterlife. Those who heard Isaiah's vision didn't even believe in an afterlife as we think of it today. That was not a settled question in Jesus' day either. And the Bible shows us that the various sects of Judaism argued about whether the soul experienced any kind of resurrection after death or not. These visions are presented as promises from God of what we could experience in this life if everybody just got with the program. We redid that in the 60s with the what if they had a war and nobody came. But they're more than just a promised reward, even so. The visions can also be used as a yardstick to measure our progress. Jesus said that those who speak and live truly are known by their fruit. Visions of peaceful, nonviolent, happy communities provide a concrete way to measure the fruit produced by our way of life. As the communities around us, family, church, club, town, nation, evolve and change, are they becoming more like those visions or less like those visions? If we're moving in the wrong direction, we know it's time for self-reflection and reform. That's the big picture for these things, and it's not wrong. In order to do anything hard, we need a compelling vision of the goal. We need to know that our actions have meaning and purpose if we're to stay engaged in hard things. We also need a way to measure our progress in those hard things, and it's impossible to know if we're moving in the right direction if we don't have a sense of where we're going in the first place. But like the Bible more generally, we can get in trouble if we just look at passages in isolation, even if those passages are visions of peace and healing. While the two visions reflect the nature of life in their respective eras and geographies, they have common themes of everyone getting along peacefully, equal treatment, no pain or suffering, righteous rule. But to achieve that, in both visions, there are those who must be excluded. In both visions, the wicked are destroyed, which is what allows the peaceful vision to exist for more than 20 seconds. And it doesn't take much more than 20 seconds to realize that who gets to identify and judge someone as wicked is key to whether these visions are motivating or terrifying, or both, depending on where you fall on that wicked to righteous spectrum. The white nationalist who drove 200 miles to reach a predominantly black neighborhood in Buffalo, New York, to gun down as many black people as he could in a grocery store last weekend, was motivated by a vision with almost the same characteristics as the visions in Isaiah and Revelation. So were most of those who stormed the Capitol during the January 6th insurrection, many of whom are tied to white nationalist and white supremacist groups. The only difference is who they defined as wicked and unworthy of inhabiting the holy mountain or the holy city. But although a disturbingly large percentage of them are not just white nationalists, but white Christian nationalists, they have missed a key part of these visions, and that is the identity and nature of the judge who decides all that. In Isaiah, it is the Spirit of the Lord, and in Revelation, it is God directly. Of course, they claim their views are the same as God's, a blasphemy that has been aided and abetted by the church since our nation's founding, and is unfortunately alive and well today. Last week, when I said the church has caused many, if not most, of its own problems, that is just one egregious example. And because we refuse to nip it in the bud, white Christian nationalism is now a deadly problem for the whole country. I have news. God did not die and leave white people in charge, in case you had any question. Any kind of nationalism or supremacy is a violation of God's commandment against idolatry. Moreover, in 400 years of trying it out, it has clearly failed the fruit test. The more ascendant white supremacy becomes, the less like the visions in either Isaiah or Revelation society appears. So that's one kind of criticism of these visions. When isolated from the rest of the Bible, their motivational power is open to distortion and abuse. Another kind of criticism is that those visions set the bar too high. As someone once said, if you want the wolf to lie down with the lamb, you're going to have to keep replacing the lamb. There's a sense here that if the vision is too idealistic, that will either try to force perfection through horrors like eugenics, which is another form of idolatry, or grow discouraged at our inability to actually arrive, and then we give up. And that criticism also has merit. I used to think that I couldn't possibly be a perfectionist because, well, look at my house. But then I learned that while it's easy to spot the perfectionist who can scoop up the speck of dust before it even hits the surface, perfectionism can also have the opposite effect. If I actually decide to clean something, it can take days to do a single room, or even a partial room, because the drive to get it done right and get all of it is so strong. So my more common response is to look at the mess, know I don't possibly have time to do it properly, and therefore give up doing it at all. Given my tendencies there, I probably should have stayed a Baptist. As many of you know, John Wesley was the Anglican priest who started the reform movement called Methodism in the 18th century in England, and Wesley took perfectionism to new heights. In fact, he took them to divine heights and taught that perfection was attainable in this life. After all, Jesus said in Matthew 5, verse 48, "Be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect." Wesley was so committed to the idea of perfection that he asked every person that he ordained as a Methodist minister, Do you expect to be made perfect in love in this life? And the only acceptable answer was yes. That question, I'm here to tell you, outlived Wesley, and it was a question I had to answer at my own ordination, which resulted in many sleepless nights as the day approached. My friends advised me, and just say yes and be done with it. But I wasn't going to stand in front of my bishop and the annual conference and say something that I did not mean. On the flip side, I also couldn't see how I could outlive the actuarial tables by enough years to make such an achievement even remotely possible. The focus on achieving perfection did come back to bite Wesley as the Methodist movement grew and some of its adherents started to claim that they had in fact arrived and were now perfect, claims that were hotly disputed by others who knew them. So Wesley had to backtrack a little bit to say that anybody announcing that they had attained perfection showed a lack of humility and therefore proved that they in fact were not. But he never gave up on the idea. The language just shifted to focus on the process of moving on toward perfection rather than the goal of attaining it. That was also a better fit for Wesley's process-oriented theology of God's grace, which he saw in 3 parts. The first part comes to us before we're aware of it, something he called prevenient grace, the grace that comes before. The second becomes conscious at the time we knowingly accept the faith, which Wesley called justifying grace. And then the third goes on for the rest of our lives, moving us on to perfection in a process he called sanctifying grace. Overall, it's really a very comforting view of the human condition. Unlike traditions that focus on original sin and the total depravity of the unconverted soul, Wesley cast a vision for a life covered in God's grace, the grace that surrounds and fills us before we're even aware of it, that nudges us along until the moment we recognize God's presence, and then continues to love and guide us through every moment of our lives. But with that comfort does still come the expectation that we're not just coasting along. We're expected to participate in that sanctifying process, and in so doing, acknowledge that we are indeed moving on to perfection, however slow that process might appear and in fact be. And so I was still stuck with the question. I asked a lot of people, friends, colleagues, pastors, professors, and they gave me lots of things to ponder, including whether my inability to assent to the question was an attack on God's sovereignty. Isn't it God's work, after all? Are you saying God can't do that in you? And then whether I was too focused on Aristotle, who saw perfection as correct action, instead of Plato, who viewed perfection as inner harmony. Hadn't thought about that. But I did have enough therapy by then to know that fixing my inner state was also not going to be a walk in the park. But having those options laid out with Plato and Aristotle kind of made me wonder if one of them might be closer to what the Bible, and more particularly Jesus, taught than the other. Jesus does have a very strong push towards behaving correctly, towards right action. The only time in all the Gospels that Jesus weighs in on how God will judge our lives is in Matthew 25. And it's all about what we have done. The blessed are those who fed the hungry, clothed the naked, welcomed the stranger, visited the sick and imprisoned, etc. And the cursed are those who didn't. But when it comes to how a person actually develops the capacity to do those things, to become the kind of person who does those things naturally, when it's really much easier just to sit back and do none of it, then the message of Jesus invites us to look inside ourselves. In the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapters 5 through 8, Jesus goes back to the Ten Commandments to point out that the breaking of the commandments starts with the attitude of the heart. Hate leads to killing, lust leads to adultery, etc. There are also many examples in the Gospels and in the Bible more broadly of people doing the correct outer action for the wrong inner reasons. Most importantly, though, the two commands from the Hebrew Scriptures that Jesus combines and then names as the greatest commandment are both about love. To love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's from Deuteronomy 5:6. And to love our neighbors as ourselves, from Leviticus 19:18. And I began to see that it's in love that Aristotle and Plato can get along. Love is the connective tissue between the inward heart and the outward act. It's love that allows compassionate action, even when it's done for the wrong reason, to flow along that connective tissue back inward to change the heart. And it's the empathy of heart that travels the channel of love outward to acts of service and sacrifice. It's not the action or the heart that defines a righteous act. It's both working together, each building up and strengthening the other. And then I saw that the question didn't just say, do you expect to be made perfect? But rather, do you expect to be made perfect in love? And with that, I could finally see it. Whether I still screwed up outwardly or inwardly, if each thing could travel across the connective tissue of love, it could, over time, get fixed. Anger could be softened before leading to violent acts. Serving, even when I was resentful, could travel back across that loving connection and improve the state of my heart. Best of all, I didn't have to, in fact, I could not manufacture that love on my own. It was a gift from God, given not as a reward for what I had achieved, but as the tool I would need to achieve anything truly good at all. I just had to be willing to download and install that software, and then God's love would run in the background. The love itself is perfect because it comes from God. As for the outward actions and inner life God's love is trying to regulate, I still have to replace the lamb, but far less frequently than I used to. And I got up in front of the Florida Annual Conference before my bishop and answered yes. The Bible's visions of a better world can go off the rails in any number of ways, but the thing that keeps them on track is the same. The realization that it is ultimately God's work, God's judgment, and God's love, not ours. And I think that's just perfect. Amen.